Good afternoon and most welcome to page 968. And I will today talk about direction of thinking. I mentioned David Brell's cerebellum before, and we now know that movement, physical movement and thinking is the same thing. We've known for at least 50 to 60 years that cerebellum, if it's not working correctly, we get something called ataxia in different levels. Ataxia is discoordination of movement, and it could be so severe that you can hardly move, or maybe you just have some quirks of some sort. We are all on a scale. Jumping on the board when you leave a house, for instance, can happen to everyone. It's all a matter of degree. Some people are extremely gracious, and I would like to take this book by Pedro de Alcantara, Alexander Technique, A Skill for Life. There's some photos here. You can see when thinking is working. This one is very get together. You can see it has a wholeness, but this one has broken the line of direction, and thereby also broken the direction of thinking. Because we now know that cerebellum is also the tool for arranging our thinking in a healthy way. We formally think that we can sort of pile a lot of knowledge on the pupils in school, just toss the book at them and hope something will turn out good. This is not how it works, and it has developed into a complete disaster. Things like dyslexia, ADHD, OCD and other learning impairments, and also life impairments, has developed into become 10 to 20 times as more common. And the reason for this is the neglect of the cerebellum. We don't understand that it's the same thing to move graciously to think effectively. There is absolutely no difference. One could compare good thinking to harmonious notes. This is how Pedro de Alcantara does in his first book. And we now know that understanding how time works, something that Henri Bergson explained as retention and pretension, means that the more nesting we can have, the more retention and pretension in each what can we call that? Oh, you couldn't call it moment, but for every time you do that, you get a now, and that now is nested in another now, which is nested in another now. This is the nesting of time, and the more skilled you are bodily wise, the more skilled you will be at doing these nows. So it means that you will have no or lesser access of time if you have lesser of a balance or coordination. The cerebellum is like this pendulum you can find on a piano, metaphorically clicking, giving some time, just that the cerebellum can do things fractal wise. This is not a fractal, this is a digital one. Either the pendulum is in that direction or in that direction, but the cerebellum is truly fractal. That means that it can be an infinite of depth. Alcantara describes this as the great injustice of modern time. It didn't used to be that way. People had more or less equal access to time. There was some differences, but today the differences is staggering. It means that some people don't have any access to sequencing, timing, understanding of sequences. We know that timing is incredibly important to understand written text, and that is the reason why dyslexia is developing now. Once established, this skipping pattern of the order becomes almost impossible to change. And this is one of the reasons why we today call dyslexica a handicap. Now compared to East Asia, where dyslexia is very uncommon still to this day. This is because they still train time, how to understand time. Just the simple signs of Chinese, for instance, are always done in a particular order and with a particular precision. And that means that every time you do these signs, you train fractal time. You become better and better. And that's not enough, because there is a movement inherent in the sign. This goes for a whole melody. Just like a melody is the start and the end and the passing at the very same time. Also the sign is the start, the end, and the passing at the very same time. And it actually constitutes, sometimes you can even see this written, it actually constitutes a cursive single line or two lines. It's very hard to read this. You need to have the sequencing right. And it's not about recognizing the same patterns. It's recognizing the same time. I was fascinated by this. I learned how to read most of the signs, but I could not read this. And that was not because the handwriting was so advanced. It was not a doctor's handwriting. It was not the handwriting of your grandparent. No, it was a timing effect. And that timing effect has to be learned. And it was also shown in their exquisite access to different times at the same instant. Something that made it possible for them to have a taxi system. I haven't mentioned that before, but that taxi system was just short of remarkable. You didn't have to wait for a taxi more than 1 to 2 minutes. And this was before the time of the computers. This was way before mobile phones. It was the nesting principle that made it possible for you to have your individual time as a taxi driver in an horizon that met the client, but at the very same time have a global time, which meant that all the taxi drivers could sort of work in concert. And once more, one come to think about music, because music is in its most advanced level concerted. It's a whole concert, an orchestra, playing in different tunes, different instruments, in different rhythms, and also in different pitch and strength. But still, they can constitute one single line. So we can have the start, we can have the end, we can have the processing, we can also have one single line. And this is oddly enough the wave of quantum mechanics. See here, it's one of the few times we actually have a very nice segue between classical physics, or let me say it rather like this, or our everyday physics and the physics of quantum mechanics. Because this line, that is the wave. It doesn't have any materiality to it. It is not, to read the cursive form of the Chinese signs is not a matter of pattern recognition. It's a matter of seeing the wave. It's about timing. And that timing is also our bodies. Somebody that moves in an elegant way has the capacity to store more knowledge. This is a very famous dancer. Her name is Olani Luahaine. She's a Hawaiian dancer, and she used to perform in the 40s and the 50s. Her elegance developed her whole life, but she also mentioned in her memoirs that her intellectual powers developed as well, because they are all stored in the pattern, in the movement. It is only a fractal wave that can store all the knowledge of the universe. Our brains are not enough. Not all the brains of the universe is enough. But a single wave can store an infinite amount of information or knowing. That is the concept of fractality when it gets really interesting. When you can understand it can be absolutely different. It could be multi-layered, it could be nested, it is also interpenetrative, but at the very same time goes just in one direction. And the more complexity you have, the more decisive that direction is. That is our understanding capacity. Whether it's understanding how to move or how to think, how to do retention or pretension, it is in some aspects all the same. So one could say doing the basic movements of the Alexander technique is a little bit like iterating the finer details, the filigrane details of the fern. Because oddly enough, it's the little doings of the fern that makes for its stability. Think about the fern. Oddly enough, it doesn't seem to have a stem. It doesn't even seem to have branches. In an odd fashion, it seems to be a gazillion different things, all going in different direction, all iterating themselves on different levels. But this is what makes up the stability of the fern. And of course, this is not only applies to fern, it applies also to an ordinary plant, a more advanced plant like a tree or grass. But the fern, there you can see it with your own eyes. You don't need a microscope for that. And this is the same for human beings. By iterating things, we build up from a very small pattern. And that pattern being in Alexander technique, let the neck be free so the head can move forward and upward. So your back can lengthening and widening. And to this, with this continuously going on, you can add other things. And this will become more complex. And in the beginning, you will think this is all in one, like linear line, like this. But you will start to understand it actually nests. So it is in a particular sequence. The sequencing is of very great importance. But after a while, you notice you can do it simultaneously, because our bodily movement is both sequencing and simultaneity. As I said before, there is only one direction at the same time that we have all these nestings. See the different commands, the orderings, as the nestings, and think about the direction as being that single thing that is the temporal structure of our movement. So then you have both the sort of spatial could be the sequencing, where you actually tell your body to do different things, and then you have this grand movement. And the more you understand that thinking process, intellectual thinking process, is the same thing, the easier it gets to do the work. But if you have prematurely sort of made a dividing line somewhere, and that you say to yourself that there are two different things. There are the things I do with my body, going outside, going for walks, carrying things around. And there is things I do with my mind, do calculation, do advanced reading. You have done this once more. You have divided one sphere like movement, and the other one is thinking. This is very unhelpful. This means that you lose out on both ends. You lose on the end of being able to see sameness, but you also lose out on the idea of difference. This makes it impossible to see the difference between thinking and doing. because in some ways it's not the same. There is a timing difference that is very interesting. But this covers that, so you can't understand it. It goes on top. It's a premature division that blocks understanding underneath. A little bit like the ontic move that we did in prehistory, where we decided we can no longer ask why. Why is the direction? For what am I doing something? Remember the language of the people living in the time before the pre-Socrats. They only had action, only verbs. And verbs are always pointing somewhere. They are doers. And doers, as I told before, is also an absolute presupposition for existence. Once upon a time they lost the doing, and they also lost existence. This created a lack, and they wanted to regain existence. But they didn't want to understand the whole picture. It was difficult for them to go back to the ontological question, because the forgetfulness sat in, and it sort of locked itself. So they were caught up in this eternal wish for presence and existence. And the more they wished for it, the less they got it. The more they divided the little they already had. It was a little bit a reversal of Jesus giving food to all the people on the mountain. Here we divide the little we have, so we have even less in the beginning. And what do we do for each philosophy? We rename and we lessen the things we already have. And I would say this is a rather apt analogy of what's happened. We divide what we already have. We rename it. And for every division, somehow knowledge gets even harder to access. It becomes more and more distant somewhere. Because what lies underneath this is covered. By opening this up and looking at fractality instead, the complexities, the thinking add complexity, is a little bit like you are zooming in on the coastline of Norway every time you repeat. So even if it sounds tedious, and sure as hell it's been sounding tedious to me as well, but nowadays it's no longer the case. It's just the opposite. It opens up for interesting thinking that would not have been possible otherwise. It is like opening up an interesting oyster and find that it's not only meat inside. There's a wondrous pearl. So repetition, oddly enough, in fractal theory doesn't make for boredom and repetition in the old way. It actually opens up the fractality of what already is. So we add a fractality to a meeting of two horizons. We get an extra fractality for every time we do the ordering. And that adds an extra fractal dimension to the whole thing. I would like to demonstrate, if I can borrow Kalle, for instance. He can put the camera on the table and put it on pause. So I'll ask Kalle here to help with the demonstration. I'll ask him to sit down when I say sit. Yeah, sit. We are going to try to change his imagery. And I mentioned earlier, imagery is what we project outwards. It is our intention of outwardness. And this outwardness should be pure. It should be not affected on what you want to have. And this is one of the reasons the orderings is always the same. You should not wish for pleasantries. By ordering, you get pleasantry indirectly. So if we ask Kalle to sit a little bit frontwards, so you don't, yes. And we can start with the hand. So by manipulating the body, we can get balance to come back. And this is the imagery. You can see that I'm manipulating Kalle, but at the same time he starts to think. Thinking is being balanced. This is the fragility when he finds his sitting bones. Now he's directing his attention to them. And I can feel the difference where I push. It is a little bit like his upper torso is moving more steady, whereas before he was jumping in a random way. This is preparing, and this is oddly enough something we do both with the thinking process and with the body at the same time. So here it's no real difference. And this repetitive, in the beginning boring thinking / doing is what starts the process. By adding fractality is a little bit like, for every time we do it, it gets a little bit deeper and we go into delta T depth. But also delta T width. Because we have already a widthening of the body. The back is widening here. It is widening because now it knows where it's situated. And for every time I move now, it gets steadier and steadier. This is the steadiness of the system in a balanced, chaotic way, so to speak. And one could say, our ordinary doing of things, when I walk around and I want to find a book, I go down here, it's a lack of complexity. I do not add from my own point of view actively perception. I don't have a regular regiment, I think that's the right word, regiment for what I'm doing. And that needs to be done before. Instead, I start looking for things. And looking for things is the wrong mood. You should project outwardly in spite of what's in front of you. So we need to do things that in a way ignores the environment. But when we do that, by this ignoring, by demanding beforehand what is going to happen, we actually open up. So we open up more than close off. And do remember this oddity, but this is actually how fractality works. It is repetitive, does the same thing, and as we will see in later lecture, this is actually how we learn to memorize. It's repetitive, goes over and over again, do the very same thing again. And the more complexity you can add to this, the more of your intention goes in, because the body becomes more intelligent now, and that will also inform the mind. The mind will understand more. This is very, very odd, but the thing is, now we also will be able more to discern between body, what is bodily things, what is bodily needs, and what is mind things, what is intellectual. We become less instinctual, if you like. We develop, we can become higher. Because we need to be integral, like Kalle is now. He's sitting in a more integral way. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to think straight forward. He's gaining thinking momentum. I'll ask him not to stand up. I haven't done much, and Kalle haven't done much. So just get up. So you see here, even though the standing up now looks simpler, it is because of added complexity. When he moved up before, and he sat down before rather, it was a bit quirky. So it looked more complex. But that's superficial. When we add complexity, when he starts to think and his body starts to perceive, like feeling his sitting bones, and I could also add in feeling the soles of his feet, feeling his neck, This is intentional doings. He sends out signals to his neck, to his back, and when he does that, he ignores the fact. So it's a projection. And our sensory system, this is the extra bonus, the dessert for today. Actually, our proprioception is even more degraded or more advanced than our seeing. Seeing 3 times as much goes out as come back. When it comes to proprioception, the figure is 5. We need to send 5 times as much out as we get back from proprioception. And that means that we have to have pre-established orders that we constantly do to get the fractality to be healthy. And this actually goes against intuition, I would say. Everything we do to make our bodies more lenient and soft and flexible, we think that has to do with, oh, we get into the environment, I feel the environment, I feel my body. No, it doesn't really serve any purpose to do that. And that's one of the faults of something that I usually call relaxation therapy. Used to be something of a thing in the 60s. Relax your body, feel your body. That won't do the trick. Feel your body is actually still passive, oddly enough. Here we are sending things out. Remember the ray that comes out of the eyes. Remember the signal that is in our ears. You can make that signal stronger or weaker. You make it stronger by intending not to hear, but sending something else. Oddly enough, trying to hear something will make it much harder to hear. But actively sending something out will make our exogenous signal so much stronger. And this was possible to explain thanks to Susie Frobel, actually, oddly enough. We've been talking about this earlier, especially in Kjellstad, but now it makes a lot more sense. Thank you very much, Kalle, for your cooperation, and have a good afternoon, everyone.